Column quilts are ideal projects for quilting newbies and fresh concepts for those of you who have been sewing for a while. During this three-part series, I'll show you how to replace traditional quilt blocks with sleek columns of fabric. Let's begin with the Heartbeat column quilt. The design bears a vague similarity to an EKG. Like the rhythms of the heart, the peaks and valleys of the fabric provide a pleasing movement. The stitching may be quick, yet the pleasing result is long-lasting. Quick column quilts, that's what's next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, making a difference in sewing, quilting, crafting, and needle arts for over 30 years. Amazing designs and Class A needles.
The Heartbeat quilt behind me is perfect for a baby quilt, a lap quilt, a tummy time quilt to put on the floor, your baby to roll around with, to cover up on the couch if it's just for watching television. It's pretty bright. We've made this intentionally for a baby. We have 9 different colors of fabric and then a background fabric. You can make it with prints, we can make it in coordinates. We just like this bold coloration combination. You'll see a variety of widths of strips. In this particular quilt, we cut widths from 1.5 to 4.5. It can be, and many different widths in between. And I'll give you the directions on how to do this, and you'll see that what's on the top is also on the bottom, but in a little different configuration. But before we go there, let's talk about the fabric. As I mentioned, 9 fabrics. You could have 8. Really, the choice is yours. You just make it the quilt as wide as you'd like with as many fabrics as you have. But we always like to start by pressing the fabric with a spray starch or a spray starch alternative. Gives it a little crispness, and it helps in the cutting process with the rotary cutter. So just give it a little spray, press it flat. It takes some time to do this, but you'll be pleased with the results. In the fabric, it will not ravel as much, fray as much, so spend some time. Now, the yardage that you need is really quite minimal. For the smaller quilt, maybe you only need 1/8 of a yard to 1/4 of a yard of each color. So it's a perfect scrap quilt to choose. So I'm going to kind of fold this in half, and you'll need, for this size quilt, 2 to 3 of each color. Again, in various widths. I'm going to square the first edge so that it's all squared up, and then 1.5, 2.5, 3. Just keep track of the widths that you've cut. So I'm going to cut a 2.5, and now I'm going to cut a 4. Smaller than 1.5 inches is really too small to work with, and then I'll cut 1.5 inches. So you cut strips from around 9 colors, 8 colors, whatever you'd like, and then cut the same number of strips out of the background fabric so that you have equal number of widths of the background fabric to fit the color of the fabric of one of those 9 colors. The sewing is simple. You're going to meet right sides together, stitch the top edges together, and just change stitch. As you can see here, I'm just stitching one color combination, then another, and then another, and you stitch until all of your colors have been attached. But that's not quite enough. After you stitch one end, then with keeping right sides together, you go to the other end and stitch the opposite end. And then again, chain stitch, sewing all your ends together so that after you sew one end, you have all these circles. And when you chain stitch it, then you have to cut apart so that you end up with a lot of circles like this. Circles of fabric. And this is what I'm going to be working with to create the EKG pattern that you see behind me. Now this is the part where you get your scissors, you don't do any measuring, you fold it in half just so that it isn't equal. You don't really want it equal. And then cut the background fabric and then cut the accent fabric. The top layer, place on your board or your table. I don't think you have a board like I do. Place it on your board. And the top layer, place on a stack. Then get your next color. Fold it in half, but not exactly in half. You can see my colorations. And then cut. We were making these for the first time, kind of designing. Sharon, who works with me, was a little apprehensive about doing this. I said, I don't think you can make a mistake. Then take this piece and set it aside with the other fabric. So I'm just going to keep on keeping on. Fold it in half again, and cut. Now the arrangement that I'm going to come up with right now may not be the arrangement that I'm going to end up with, but you just keep cutting until you like what you see. I think I'm going to try blue next. Now whatever you have on the top, the other half, of course, will be on the lower half of the quilt. And so you need to vary it so they're not all kind of equal. We need a pink in here, so let's find a pink that's been sewn. Here's an orange. I have enough fabric here. Here's my pink. I knew it was here. Now you can kind of do like what I'm going to do now. Just addition it first. Let's say, oh, maybe I need something about this height. So after you've made the first couple of cuts, remember to do that little addition trick. And maybe at this point I can use a lighter color. Maybe this lighter color would go wrong way, right here. So you see I have a variety of widths of colors. The length of this heartbeat is changed as well. And you'd keep going across. There's about 18 to 20 cuts on the quilt that's behind me. I'm giving you a range because if you cut a lot of narrow pieces, you'll need more strips, obviously. If a lot of wide pieces, well, you get the picture. So after you do this arrangement, and you'll have many more than I have, then see if you like it. You know, test out some colorations if you want to separate these two pinks. No, I don't like that. Those two are too close together. Oh, try this. Whatever the case may be, lay it out until you get an interesting pattern. Then meeting right sides together, sew the strips in pairs. Sew these two pieces together, these two pieces together, and these two, and sew along the edges. After you press the seams, sew the pairs together. And here's a small sample of what I would like to show you what happened. Here's my one half of the quilt top. A small sampling, but you can see the interesting effect. Now that I have half of it, do the same thing with the other half. What samples have been left over, I lay it out in the opposite direction. Then place down the next piece. I think you get the idea, with the bright colors toward you instead of away from you, because this is the lower half of the quilt. And do the arrangement. And as I'm putting this here, we have two. Oh, that's not going to work, so we're just move it around. And you do not want to, of course, have the same coloration as the first quilt, which it's undoubtedly you will not have. So you just keep laying these out, as many as you used for the top half of the quilt. And then after cutting those out, or making the arrangement, I think you see what's going to happen. You lay them out, sew it in pairs, and then put the pairs together. Finally, after pressing the seam allowances, you meet the two halves together, and do lay them out. Lay out the top with the bottom before sewing the bottom half together, to make sure you like this arrangement, so that you get an interesting EKG of fabric. It's a fun way of working with scraps of fabric. Make sure you have plenty of background of fabric. We do like to, in this instance, press the seams open because you don't have to worry about shading of fabric, and then add it to an interesting background fabric and you have a quilt top. Not limited to a baby or a lap quilt, the Heartbeat column quilt is ideal for larger sizes as well. Using gray, white, and black prints with a neutral background, the quilt design takes on a modern look. To adjust the size of the bed quilt, just vary the number of the strips, the width, and the length of the columns. Simply by changing the color of the fabrics, you go from a Heartbeat EKG look to a night scene of a city. I think this is really stunning in these neutral colors, lots of prints instead of just solids. But we've also changed the width. This is a double to full-size bed quilt. Instead of cutting the strips 1.5 to 4 inches wide, they start at 2.5 and go up to 6.5. You just have to make certain that if you have 2 strips that are 6.5 inches wide, you cut 2 strips for the background that are 6.5 inches wide, plus a little more. I'll get to that as we go along. If you want to just see the arrangement again, here's a 6.5-inch strips of this negative look of a leaf on a white background, and its complement is found on the other side of the quilt, and it's a longer section. The same principle applies. I'm going to be sewing a neutral strip to a print strip in a tube, and then offset the cutting at the folds. This wider width works great for prints. We're working with a guy print here. We have some atlases, some maps, kind of fun looking with a gray background. But I want to talk about not only prints, but making the quilt longer. Since most fabrics are 42 inches wide, cotton fabrics, and you put a 42 and a 42, the longest you get, you'd have to lengthen a little bit to get a king or a full or even a double bed. So what we like to do is add an extra part of a strip. So for a full to double, each of the neutral backgrounds is going to have a 42-inch, plus it's going to have 1/4 of a strip. So here's a strip that's folded in half again, quarter marking it, and you don't even have to mark it, just simply cut. And then cut the other fold. This is 1/4 of a strip, approximately 10 inches. Let's see if I can get that in the right fold, here we go. And then this section, as I mentioned, about 10 inches, is stitched to 1 42-inch length. So there you go. There's one for the double and the full. For the queen, you're going to use a 42-inch, this is folded in half, and then the next piece just fold in half, not in force. So it's a strip and a half. And the hardest part seems to me today to cut the folds. There, just cut that fold. So again, cut it in half and you get 1.5. Then the same principle applies. Cut a section, well, I'll cut it right about here, and then again at the fold, and you have your sections. Only I forgot to hold on to it, the background will be just slightly longer and giving you the length you need for your longer bed quilt. Now, after you've pieced all these together, the same principle I showed you earlier, you can place it on of course, a batting and a background fabric, and for the background fabric, we used leftovers. We had lots of black and white prints, so whatever we had left over, we just pieced and pieced and pieced together until we had a large enough section to make the backing of the fabric. Characteristic of a modern quilt, rarely do they have borders, so we didn't add borders. It was a fast way to put together a column quilt. This speedy queen-size quilt is designed with a very easy lesson in color coordination. Simply find a print you love for the narrow columns and choose 5 colors from the print to use for the column colors. The interruptions, well, they're horizontal strips. Stop the lengthwise movement while creating a very artistic design. I designed this quilt on graph paper with colored pencils, and I decided how large I'd like to make it, a queen size. Drew out the dimensions and started filling in the colors. Knowing that strips of fabric are generally 42 inches long, I use that as the basis to create the quilt. And it's about as simple as you can get to get something very large and dramatic. Here's the print that I chose. And you can see the polka dots have lots of colors in them. I chose 5 colors from this for the columns of this quilt. Now when you look at the quilt behind me and you look at these strips on my table, they're not at all the same size. Well, because the strips on the table are half the size that I used in the actual quilt. So keep in mind, you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit, that these strips are not really what the numbers tell you. You can certainly vary the sizes of the columns, but the sizes that I worked with and are printed in the book that accompanies today's program, the pink that's on the outer edges, 7.5 inches, then the orange, 4.5, 10.5, the biggest ones for the turquoise, 4.5, my little note tells me for the red, and then the green in the middle is 7.5 inches. And then these colors mirror image with the green in the center, then goes the red, the turquoise, orange, and pink that you'll see as I stitched along and when I put the strips together. That polka dot print is cut up in many, many, many narrow strips that are 3.5 inches wide. And the 45-inch strips are all sewn together. It's kind of mindless sewing that you're going to be putting these strips together. I enjoy it actually because you can kind of think as you're sewing and daydream a little bit. And you keep sewing these strips together. And then after sewing half of it, as I mentioned, you repeated it. So then the red comes again and then another turquoise. And that whole length is called a strata. Layers of strips put together. You can use the same pressing techniques I detailed earlier using a spray starch or a starch alternative. Press the seams open. That's kind of my new favorite way of working with quilts. And then we're going to do a little trimming, a little cutting. And give me a moment to unfold my fabric. So here's my whole strata, this first strata that has been sewn together. And I have another one hiding underneath here, so let me just straighten it up. So this section, in reality, would be 42 inches in length. And here's a close-up of the quilt behind me, the middle section. And it's almost 80 inches wide, and it's 42 inches in length, and it takes up the majority of the quilt. So you have created about half of the quilt by sewing these strips together. After you've sewn these together, you're going to sew another one identical to this. And it's underneath this one, and it's not quite laid out as smoothly as I'd like, so give me a moment. And you're going to cut this one apart. You're going to cut it into smaller sections. They're going to be 17 to 18 inches in length. So this is normally 42 inches in length, so this would be 17 and 17, and then you'll have a little bit left over that's you don't need. So this section, let me pull this up, is going to be placed on the bottom and the top of the quilt. The middle, it's called an interrupted quilt. The middle has a green section bookended by the print. And then we would simply put the big section in the middle, and I can't even fit this half scale one on here. And let's take a look at the finished quilt. The interrupted column is the horizontal column, goes across that quilt, giving it some impact, and then those shorter sections, the 17-inch lengths, are below this interrupted column section. So let me lift up this one. It's a lot of fabric, but you make a queen-size quilt, and any pattern is going to have a lot of fabric, but this time you didn't do a lot of stitching. At the very end, I put a border around this area to kind of frame it a little bit, and then had it professionally quilted by a friend, Sue, who is a long arm quilter. It was dramatic to make, starting with that print and working with big columns and a lot of straight stitching. When you think of quilts, I'm sure the first image that comes to mind is a patchwork design cut and sewn from cotton fabric. Today, my Nancy's Corner guest makes traditional patchwork designs, but from a very different medium, cold, hard steel. Here to tell us about his art is Nathan Winkler of the Steel Company, who lives in Fort Payne, Alabama, who joins us via Skype. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy, Nathan.
Thank you, Nancy. Pleasure to be here.
This is a fascinating story. Instead of fabric and thread, you work with steel, barn board, and tacks. Tell our viewers how you got started making your kind of quilts.
Well, what actually happened is I went on a brief trip up to Iowa in the winter of 2010 with my mother. And since I was already doing recycling of the barn wood, which is tearing down barns locally here where I'm from, I just naturally noticed the dilapidated barns around the landscape up in that area. And actually, that's how I first saw my first barn quilt, is by just paying attention and just seeing the different dilapidated barns. And it was just something that kind of stuck with me. And later on that year, about August 2010, I decided to go ahead and traditionally start painting some pieces, just some pieces that I'd come up with off the internet. And I liked it, but I didn't really like how it has to be really perfect to do on the taping of the lines and all. So I was looking for another medium that would really match my personality and my style, which is unperfect. And and I happened to just run across a piece of tin from a barn that I tore down recently before that, and it started after that.
So you recycle the tin, you flatten it out, and then you cut it?
It's already flat. A traditional barn roof has a piece of it's called 5V metal. It's got 5 small ribs, and it's got 9-inch flat spaces on either side of the center rib. And so I cut those out is how I get, and so I get like a flat canvas to work from, and so that's how I get the canvas.
So the patchwork pieces are the steel or the tin, and then you use part of the barn wood as well.
I do. I use the one-by material off the sides of the barns or wherever I get it from, and I rip those down and just make a really simple, frame to go around it, and it seems to work. So I enjoy doing it. I love it.
And they're really attractive. I like quilt designs, and obviously you do too. And what's your favorite? Do you have a favorite patchwork design?
I would say that I like collaborations or collections. I like to kind of do things that have meaning to them, some kind of background history, and I really like all the patterns out of the Underground Railroad series written by Eleanor Burns. And I was actually given that as a gift when I spoke at a local quilt guild here, the Stitcher 2 sewers that are in Hammondville, Alabama. They give me that as a gift, and when I started looking through that book and just really seeing the cohesiveness of that whole design, then the Drunkard's Path is probably my favorite pattern to do. But that whole series is really intriguing to me. I really enjoy that. And
you use a lot of tacks. We use a lot of stitches, but you use a lot of tacks, don't you?
Yeah, like say on the Drunkard's Path, there's probably on a 2-foot by 2-foot piece, there's around 400 tacks, and I have to pre-punch those as well before I ever put the tacks in. So yeah, it's a process.
It's labor intensive. I love the rust that comes through the patina of the tin. You don't really paint the steel at all, do you?
I don't do it unless it's requested, which is rare. But I love to let the different rust patterns actually become like fabric to me, like the way I see fabric. Just the different designs and that the rust makes as it ages, and it just really I love that. That's my color palette, is really the rust palette.
You tell our viewers about your vision that you have for a quilt trail in your area.
Yeah, it's something that's not really known around here. I've already been promoting for about the last year on getting a quilt trail started here in Mentone, Alabama, which is up on Lookout Mountain. It's a process, and I've probably given away, before this ever happened. I've been doing this for 3 years, and I've probably given away way more than I've ever sold. And so the town of Mentone is dotted with my pieces, and so and from 3 years ago, that was actually my vision 3 years ago. And so I kind of started by just giving them away and getting them out there for people to see and try to get that momentum started. And it's slow, but it's coming. I'm getting some other feedback from some other people that have done quilt trails in their area, which is really helpful. So
Well,
I hope it just goes and just gets big. So
I think it will, Nathan, and I'd like to invite you to come to our studios in a couple of years to tell us about how your vision has expanded, and thank you for being our guest.
hey, I've enjoyed it, Nancy. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Nathan. Well, if you'd like to know more about the Steel Quilt Company, you can go to our website, nancyzieman.com, rewatch this interview or any of our 70 past programs. Click on Nancy's Corner and find more about Nathan. As always, thank you for joining us. Bye for now.
Nancy Zieman has written a book entitled Quick Column Quilts that includes instructions for 13 quilted projects and all the techniques featured in this 3-part series. It's $18.99 plus shipping and handling. To order the book, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2804. Order item number U8743, Quick Column Quilts. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at nancyzieman.com to see additional episodes, Nancy's blog, and more. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Class A Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Pellon. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.